A special Veterans Day story. Thursday is Veterans Day when we honor those who served in the armed forces for the United States of America. Today you will hear about the story of a World War II United States Marine hero, a friend of mine. Sergeant James Smith, in disregard of his life in Tulagi Island in the Solomons, neutralized Japanese weapons fire, enabling the enemy to be destroyed. Then, on Guadalcanal proper, Sergeant Smith, on his own initiative, with 4 Marines, engaged the enemy in close combat and prevented the Japanese from overrunning the Marines on a ridge. Next week, I will tell you what it means to be in the army of the Lord. James Smith, a personal friend of mine, he lives in Fairfax City, and soon he will be 101 years old. I often wondered how he came out of Guadalcanal alive. You may think so too when you hear the story of this Marine hero. As Jim would tell you, once a Marine, always a Marine. The city of Fairfax honored Jim on his 100th birthday with a parade and then a ceremony in front of his house as Jim sat there in a chair on the front lawn. Jim Smith enlisted in the Marines in 1939 on his 19th birthday. On discharge from the Marines, Jim married, and he and his first wife had 5 children and lived an honorable life and was active in his church in the army of the Lord. Jim expressed gratitude from time to time that he survived a concussion grenade in the Guatemala and which landed between his legs, and he was able to live and have a fruitful life. Sergeant James Smith first served in Cuba and then was transferred to the Pacific Theater of Operations, and he was stationed in American Samoa. Jim was a radio communicator in the Marine Radar Battalion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Edson. They were known as Edson Raiders, and for good reason. You will learn why. As a background to engaging the Japanese enemy in Guatemala, there was a decided difference of opinion between General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Bill Halsey as to the need to capture Guadalcanal. Halsey prevailed and would use the Marines to invade the Guadalcanal island. The first phase called for the Marines to take control of Tulagi Island, just off the coast of Guadalcanal and the middle length of that island. This small island was 2 miles long by a half a mile wide. A small force of Marines established a foothold on the island and set up a command post. Sergeant Smith was part of a patrol to search for the Japanese stronghold on the island. They ran into a Japanese patrol and came under intense fire. All of the patrol, except for Sergeant Smith, decided to return to the command post. Now, I want to read to you from the Silver Star awarded to Sergeant Smith. Quote, "The Silver Star is awarded to Sergeant James Smith for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity while serving with the 1st Marine Brigade on Tulagi, 7 August 1942. While his patrol was subjected to intense Japanese machine gun fire and rifle fire, and then disregarding his own personal safety, worked his way with great difficulty around the enemy's flank, and from this position charged the Japanese force, neutralizing the hostile fire with his actions, enabling a patrol to destroy the enemy. Here's what happened. Jim said the Japanese forces retreated into a limestone cave under fire from him, and he kept them there by firing from time to time. He radioed the command post to advise them where he was, and the patrol was sent out up to where Smith was located, and they carried with them 5-gallon cans of gasoline. From above the cave entrance, they poured the gasoline and ignited it with a hand grenade. The enemy was destroyed. Sergeant Smith, by the way, was slightly wounded by rifle fire from the Japanese forces. When Admiral Halsey was given an account of what had happened to take place on Tulagi Island, and that Sergeant Smith was awarded a Silver Star, Admiral Halsey wanted to personally thank Sergeant Smith and pin the medal on him. That was eventually done. In my words, Sergeant Smith almost single-handedly was responsible for wiping out the Japanese forces on Tulagi Island. Also, it is likely that if Tulagi Island remained in the hands of Japanese forces, the invasion of Guadalcanal proper may never have taken place. Now to the story of the invasion of Guadalcanal. The landing of the Marines on Guadalcanal in September was a complete surprise to the Japanese, according to Sergeant Smith. The Marines were able to occupy a ridge above an airfield built by the Japanese. The ridge was called by the military as Bloody Ridge, but the Marines called it Edson's Ridge. Now I pick up the facts from many history write-ups. By September 1942, American Marines and Japanese forces were fighting a vicious battle around the airfield. The Marines guarding the perimeter were from the Marine Division, Edson Raiders. Lieutenant Colonel Edson was already on his way to becoming a legend and would cement his legend on Guadalcanal. On the night of 12 September 1942, Japanese troops engaged the Marines on the ridge. The Japanese attack was premature, however, as other of their units failed to reach the point of attack. The small Japanese force withdrew to regroup for an attack the next night. On the afternoon of 13 September, Lieutenant Colonel Edson addressed his men. Quote, "You men have done a great job so far, but I have one more thing to ask of you. We must hold out just one more night. I know we have been out without sleep for a long time and have lacked food, but I expect another attack, and I believe they will come through here. If we hold, I have every reason to believe we will be released," unquote. Two Japanese forces assaulted Marines on the 13th of September and dislodged some of the Marines from their hilltop position. Edson ordered them toward his command post in the center of the ridge. A third Japanese assault slammed into the Marines, which sent them reeling. Edson appeared with forceful language and spirit and turned the Marines around to face the enemy. Over 2,500 Japanese were facing only 800 Marines. Wave after wave of the Japanese came on. Edson sent the Para-Marines against an exposed Japanese flank with fixed bayonets. They caught the Japanese by surprise, and the Japanese were driven off the hill. Marine military fire inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese. If that was not enough, the Marines fought off the Japanese in hand-to-hand combat in the pitch black of night. Then the beleaguered Edson Raiders were assisted by the 2nd Marine Battalion and the U.S. Army Air Corps Cobras, and the Japanese forces retreated into the jungle and away from Edson's Ridge. The tenacity of the Marines in holding their position saved the battle for the Americans. Now, where was Sergeant Smith? Sergeant Smith and his small patrol proceeded where the ridge led into the jungle. They came across a Japanese patrol that was retreating and exchanged rifle fire with them. Then a Marine threw a hand grenade at the Japanese. One of them picked it up and threw it back at the Marines. It had tape on it to prevent it from exploding. The Marine took off the tape, counted 3, and tossed it back. Sergeant Smith said it was hilarious, but not at that time. Then for Sergeant Smith, time stood still as they fought the Japanese, and he saw a Japanese grenade coming towards him. It was spraying sparks and landed between his legs. In a split second, he rolled over 3 or 4 times, holding his arms against his face. That saved him from being killed, and as the small metal fragments of the grenade lodged in his forearm. He then knew that the grenade was like a concussion grenade. He pulled the fragments out of his arms, washed himself in a small pool that turned red, and then went back into battle again. Here is what was written in the Silver Star, 2nd Silver Star awarded to Sergeant James Smith. On the nights of 13 and 14 September, separated from his communications platoon, when the positions of his battalion were under severe attack by the Japanese, Sergeant Smith, on his own initiative, proceeded with 4 of his comrades to the front lines and fiercely engaged the enemy in close combat. His great personal valor during this action, in which he was wounded, was the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. Sergeant Smith served as a radio communicator in one last battle on Guadalcanal, even though he was wounded. With the conquest of Guadalcanal by the Americans, Sergeant Smith was evacuated to New Zealand, where he served until the end of the war. Guadalcanal was an important island in the Solomons Group. The loss of Guadalcanal by the Japanese armed forces impeded Japan in its course of the war in the Pacific. For the Americans, Guadalcanal became a needed land-based airfield, and many military historians feel that beating the Japanese on Guadalcanal led to a change in the war in the Pacific to the advantage of the Americans. Next week, I will share with you what it means to be a member of the Lord's Army. I haven't forgotten about giving you my thoughts on the healing of the woman bleeding for 12 years when she cured when she touched the garment of the Lord. God bless you, and express your gratitude to someone this week who made a difference in your life.